Wilgefortis was a fascinating saint, a probably non-existent Christian Portuguese princess who'd been told by her father, according to the story, that she had to marry the pagan king of Sicily. And she prayed to God to do something so that she wouldn't have to marry this man. And she woke up in the morning to find that she had a beard. So I'm Hannah Skoda. I'm the Medieval History Fellow at St John's College in Oxford, and I teach and research on the later Middle Ages. And this is a HistoryExtra Academy course on late medieval England. This week we're going to be looking at religion in late medieval England. This was an era of great suffering and unimaginable challenges. 1348 saw the outbreak of plague, killing up to 60% of the population. Bubonic plague rapidly became endemic, with some years seeing particular peaks. And often those peaks coincided with catastrophic harvest failures. It's also a period of climate change. The 14th century ushers in what's often known as the Little Ice Age. And then, alongside these exogenous shocks, society produced plenty of its own problems. The 100 Years' War began in 1337, and it lasted over a century until 1453. Most of it's not fought on English soil, but it's nevertheless expensive and depleting. It's also a period of political instability. King Edward II was probably murdered in 1337. Richard II was deposed in 1399. From 1422 we see the long minority and then complete inadequacy of Henry VI, which heralded the decades-long conflict of the Wars of the Roses and a series of abrupt regime changes. So given all these challenges, it's all the more extraordinary to witness the resilience of late medieval people. They went about their lives, they tilled the fields, they harvested the crops, they manufactured new products, they built extraordinarily beautiful buildings. They loved, they hated, and they certainly laughed. And much of this resilience came through contemporary spirituality. Medieval religion was a lot more than just comfort in the face of suffering. It provided ways to make sense of life, to celebrate, and also to innovate. So this is a facsimile of a little lead pilgrimage badge from the later Middle Ages. It's actually from the village where I grew up. It's a little hard to make out the rather strange figure here, but you can just about see a little man in a robe. He's wearing a robe because he's a master from the University of Oxford. He was a man named John Schorne, and we can actually find evidence of this figure in the university matriculation lists from the late 13th century. He was then appointed rector at North Marston, an otherwise obscure parish in Buckinghamshire. And at the time, the village was plagued by drought. John Schorne apparently struck his staff on the ground and a spring miraculously appeared. And to this day, it is believed by many to have healing properties, and it was recently restored. You can go and visit, it's lovely. But his more zany miracle is shown on this little badge. You can just about see that he's holding a boot, and you can just about see a little face poking out of the boot. This is the devil. So John Schorne is famous for having dealt with a recalcitrant devil by forcing him into a boot. It's a most unusual miracle. It might be a misreading of the fact that the holy water that John Schorne had drawn forth was supposed to cure gout, and gout's often known as the devil in the boot. But this image of the devil in the boot really took hold. Lots of pilgrims visited the site after John Schorne's death in 1313, and many of these pilgrims would have purchased a little badge like this one. The restored well in the village has a lovely little model of a devil in the boot, which children can pop back in by pumping at the well. And sometimes this is said to be the origin of the Jack-in-the-Box. So why does this rather strange story matter? It gives us a sense of the joy and the humour of medieval religious practice. It also gives us a sense of the comfort and indeed the physical cures which late medieval religion was supposed to offer. News about John Schorne spread pretty widely. This is a gorgeous image of him from Sudbury in Suffolk, for example. Pilgrimage to the site was a personal quest, but it was also one which offered the possibility of fellowship. Perhaps the most famous text from the late 14th century is Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And these, of course, remind us that pilgrimage was not just about personal religious devotion, but it was about friendship, support, solidarity, and community. Because, of course, the pilgrims in Geoffrey Chaucer's text amuse and entertain one another on their way to Canterbury. The cult of John Schorne was never officially endorsed by the papacy, but nor was it condemned. And this is really important. There really isn't a clear distinction in this period between popular religion and official religion. We're talking about a really effervescent religious context when individual spirituality was often powerful and comforting. But communities also found expression and fellowship through religion. And some of this was absorbed through institutions, and some of it emerged organically as responses to local needs, as we can see with the case of John Schorne. But what's really interesting with John Schorne's cult is that it became so popular and so famous that the Dean of Windsor heard about it. This was a man called Richard Beauchamp, and he decided to purchase Schorne's bones in the 1470s and relocate them to St George's Chapel at Windsor, which really then marked the demise of poor old North Marston, who no one needed to visit anymore. And Richard Beauchamp got a papal licence to do this. So you can really see the entanglement and the intertwining of local popular concerns and official ecclesiastical concerns. But a period of intense religious feeling is likely to produce disagreements. So around 100 years after John Schorne had studied at Oxford, another key and actually far more famous figure also made his voice heard in the city. This was John Wycliffe. So Wycliffe was responsible for a complete translation of the Bible in the 1380s into Middle English. In many ways, this was a response to the growing demand for intimate, individual religious experience. But Wycliffe went further, and he sowed the seeds of what would become a heretical movement known as Lollody. Lollody spread quite rapidly, largely through preaching and through the circulation of texts. Lollody's central ideas were compelling. They challenged the notion of transubstantiation. So this is the idea that the bread and the wine literally become the body and blood of Christ during the Eucharist as part of the liturgy. Lollards challenged the role of images. They challenged the role of saints and shrines. They undermined the idea of baptism and confession as sacraments. They challenged church wealth, and they challenged church involvement in secular affairs. So these are obviously really dramatic challenges to ecclesiastical authority. And unsurprisingly, the clampdown on Lollody was severe. It came not just from the church as an institution, but this kind of persecution of Lollards was sustained by the willingness of communities to report on suspected heretics. And it was then given dramatic impetus by the involvement of the state. a famous statute called De Heretico Comburendo, on the burning of heretics in 1401, defined Lollardy not just as a heretical threat to the church, but as sedition against secular rulers too. So Lollards were dramatically and horrifically persecuted. But Lollardy didn't vanish entirely, even if the momentum of the movement was certainly stayed by this persecution. I think actually what's really striking here is the depth of religious commitment revealed by the heresy, and the ways in which many of these so-called Lollard beliefs were actually on a spectrum with really intensely held Catholic beliefs in the period anyway. In some cases, it was actually quite hard to distinguish actual Lollards from other committed Christians. And this is reflected in language too. So returning to the Canterbury Tales, the host in the stories, someone called Harry Bailey, nastily says about the character of the parson, "O Jankin, be ye there? I smell a loller in the wind." And what he means is not that the parson's a heretic, but that he's a prissy, priggish fellow, self-righteous, religiously intense and annoying. And in many ways, this is what's most interesting about Lollardy. It's a symptom of the depth of religious feeling and interest in this period. Around the same time, we meet the wonderful figure of Margery Kemp. Margery was an early 15th century woman, also accused of being a Lollard on several occasions. It would seem simply because she was so intense, and to many people she just seemed so annoying. But she's not a Lollard, she was absolutely an Orthodox Catholic. She was a lay woman, which means she's not a nun, she's not in religious orders. And she had at least 14 children. And she had a series of intense visions. And we know so much about her because she dictated an extraordinary book. And you can see one of the folios of the manuscript here. It's one of the very earliest autobiographies, and it's called The Book of Margery Kemp. She wants us to know about her love of God and her intense spiritual experiences. As I said, she was not in holy orders, she's not highly educated, she's an ordinary woman in King's Lynn in Norfolk. And it's this sense that the very ordinary could have these wonderfully intense experiences, which suggests something very special about religious devotion in this period. It's not just those who were, quote unquote, privileged enough to be able to devote their lives to God. Margery tells us that Christ told her to love him with her whole being. She tells us that he told her to stop wearing a mortificatory hair shirt, that kind of thing wasn't necessary, to stop eating meat. Christ apparently told her to take the Eucharist every Sunday. He told her to pray until 6 o'clock every day. They're very precise instructions. And apparently Christ also promised to give her victory over her enemies and the ability to answer scholars wisely and decisively, even without a high level of education. So it's a love affair of sorts, and it's all extremely performative and public. And of course, Margery was a woman. Religion presented women with particular opportunities in this period. And indeed, despite the kind of clampdown which we find provoked on Lollardy, it's actually a period of quite capacious views, quite expansive views. Near King's Lynn, at Worsted, again in Norfolk, we find an image of Saint Wilgefortis. Wilgefortis was a fascinating saint, a probably non-existent Christian Portuguese princess who'd been told by her father, according to the story, that she had to marry the pagan king of Sicily. And she prayed to God to do something so that she wouldn't have to marry this man. And she woke up in the morning to find that she had a beard. The King of Sicily was repulsed, so he didn't marry her, and her father was so angry that he crucified her. So it's an extraordinary story, and Wilgefortis became very popular right across Europe. And this was a saint who appealed to a wide range of people in the later Middle Ages. We know from evidence in wills that many men turned to Wilgefortis. But we've also got some fragmentary evidence that unhappily married women turned to the saint for comfort and solace. There's even a story recounted by Sir Thomas More in the early 16th century that wives would bring a peck of oats to Wilgefortis as an offering in the hope that she would rid them of their unwanted husbands. But of course, Wilgefortis was also a figure who troubled gender boundaries. And this must have been a figure who offered comfort and solace to non-binary people. What's so striking about the many images of Wilgefortis is that there is no sense of the grotesque. Wilgefortis had been a woman, the story tells us. She is blessed by God with a beard. And she, or they, are shown by sculptors and image makers as lovely, aesthetically pleasing, extraordinary and special. And again, this is not a story of popular versus institutional religion. There's even a statue of Wilgefortis looking absolutely stunning in the Henry VII chapel in Westminster Abbey, despite the fact that Wilgefortis was never officially canonised or endorsed by the papacy. Back to Margery Kempe. She provides us with a brilliant reminder that medieval religion was both local and global. She was notorious in her local town, but she also travelled to the Holy Land in 1413 to 15. She then undertook a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain in 1417 to 18, and yet another to Aachen in Germany in the 1430s. She was extraordinarily dedicated, and she had a very strong sense that her place as a woman devoted to religion was part of a much, much wider Christian community. One didn't need to have this kind of intense, lightning personality of Margery to have a sense of participation in a wider religious community. This is an image of St. Zita from the Church of Hawley near Banbury in Oxfordshire. Zita was a servant girl from Lucca in Italy, and you can just about make out on this rather battered fresco that she's holding some household keys and pans. So Zita was the patron saint of domesticity. Her cult can be traced along trade routes from Lucca to England, spreading to parishes along these commercial routes. So she's another really emphatic reminder in local parish contexts of a wider Christian community. But she's also a patron saint of domesticity, of finding holiness in the everyday. Of course, religious devotion in this period is not just about the domestic, it's also about big, grand gestures. And the role of community meant that huge sums of money could be collected for grand projects. This is an image of Exeter Cathedral, a gorgeous example of 14th century decorated Gothic architecture. It has the longest uninterrupted medieval stone vaulted ceiling in the world. But much of the original Norman building was kept too, notably the towers, which you can see here. Medieval Christianity was about continuity and innovation. But I'd like to finish with a much more modest context. Just a few miles away from Exeter is the small village of Holme on Dartmoor. It has a large church of Dartmoor granite built around 1300 and enlarged around 1500. Inside, its crowning glory is the rood screen, consisting of an absolutely extraordinary series of images of saints, painted between about 1480 and 1500. It represents a window for us into contemporary sensibilities of really humble people living a pretty much subsistence lifestyle on Dartmoor. It tells us what mattered to people, what they were worried about. This is St. Roche, the patron saint of plague victims. This is St. Margaret, the patron saint of women in childbirth. We can see St. Bavo painted here, the patron saint of falconry. And St. Catherine, the uneducated saint who defended her faith to a bunch of snooty, educated scholars. And as you can see from the still lush colours, this was a considerable investment for the parish. So we're talking now around 1500. We're right on the eve of the Reformation, and religious life was truly flourishing in England. So next week, we'll be looking at family and community in late medieval England.